For many years, I wondered whether I should share this story. See, there was always the fear that perhaps many people would think of me as unstable. Well, this happened many years ago when I was a young man. Now I'm old. I don't care. I have nothing to lose. So if you're interested, I will tell the tale of what happened to me way back in 1972. I was 15 years old, and like most 15-year-olds, I knew everything. I mean everything. I had grown up on the predominantly English West End of Montreal. I was having my share of teenage rebellion back in 1972. I grew my hair long, started talking back a lot. Yeah, I remember 1972, and if I can just sit here and close my eyes, it all comes back to me. I used to argue with my father about the Vietnam War, and I was a precocious little jerk, actually. My friends and I used to have seances in teenage basement parties. It seemed like innocent fun at the time. I also read some books on astral projection and thought it sounded really cool. I pictured myself as some kind of groovy little wizard guy. The truth is, I was a conceited, amoral little narcissist who only cared about himself. That summer I also discovered something else, that I could alter my consciousness tremendously with the aid of psychedelics. These weren't your kids' psychedelics either. We're talking Owsley produced product from California. Enough to give you a good long trip. That same summer had been eventful for me. I had visited England, and later in the summer trotted off on a Greyhound bus to Providence, Rhode Island to visit a girl. All in all, a very eventful summer, I thought, as I dreaded the approach of September and the return to high school. Now, there were two kinds of kids in my high school. There were the rich kids that lived in Beaconsfield, whose fathers were doctors or lawyers or owned car dealerships. And then there were the rest of us, kids from working class or immigrant families, the kids that lived on the wrong side of the tracks. They were my friends. They were real. For the most part, I hated high school. I hated all the classes. I was bored. I was restless. Except for one class, and that was my art class. I always looked forward to that because it seemed less rigid. And I would visit the Museum of Fine Arts in Montreal and felt truly inspired by it. It was my first exposure to real art. Well, my art teacher that year happened to be a batty old lady. I thought she was 80 years old, but I don't know how old she was, but she was probably well past retirement. And she was very unimpressed with me and my hippie friends. She thought we were rude, crude, and downright disgusting. And I suppose she was right on one level. Well, she used to walk around the school, and she would be holding a pillow with, on top of that pillow, was a human skull, and she had named him Marmaduke. He went everywhere with her. We sketched him. It was a good lesson, but still Marmaduke somehow gave me the creeps. One day in that class, they introduced a new student. I looked up bored from my sketching and noticed this rather pretty little young thing with granny glasses and a cool hippie dress on. She looked kind of interesting. I thought this for further investigation. No more than a day or two later, We were in class and we had a slide projector on, and we were looking at slides of great works of art. And the new girl actually came up and sat next to me. And I kept looking at her, and there was something fascinating about her. Very appealing on one level, but very dark on another. I was still very intrigued. All my friends lived in a little town about 10 miles from the high school. I'm sure it's no longer a little town, but it was a little town named St. Anne de Bellevue. And it was a pretty little place, and all my friends lived there. It was kind of a working class town, but it was very old and historic and funky, and I liked hanging out there. So I used to pretend I lived there and hop on the school bus and go and visit my friends. Well, after school, I decided to hop on the bus, and much to my surprise, there she was, sitting on the bus. I couldn't believe it. This seemed really strange. This seemed more than strange, and yet I was totally fascinated by her. I kept staring at her, wondering, what was it? She wasn't spectacular looking or anything. I mean, she was cute and everything, but what was it that was having this strange effect on me? We started talking and hit it off pretty well. We were laughing and found out that she had an interesting history of being a runaway, and I thought that was pretty cool. She'd lived in a commune. I thought that was even cooler. And she'd had quite a lot of experience for a girl her age. I think she was 16 and going on 32. I remember our first date very well. We were sitting in a darkened movie theater watching a 1970 film called Joe. I kept glancing over at her out of the side of my eye. She almost seemed to have an aura about her, something I couldn't quite place, something intoxicating. When she put her hand on my thigh, my teenage hormones kicked into gear, and I was lost. It was raining that night, and I can remember us holding hands and skipping through the puddles, laughing like little children. I thought I was in love. At least, love in the way a 15-year-old boy understands it. Well, pretty soon we were an inseparable item. We went everywhere together, hung out with our hippie teenage friends in a boathouse that was closed up for the season. Somebody would always have a few bucks for a gram of hash or a nickel bag of weed, and we'd sit in there and smoke to our heart's content. She told me all about her former life and her days as a runaway, and we talked about astral projection, and we talked about psychic phenomena, and finally we made love. Or at least made love in the way that a 15-year-old virgin makes love. That is to say, I felt rather clumsy and inadequate. Still, now I felt I was a man because I was no longer a virgin. And this will get much, much better, I thought. And I was right. There was a lot of good rock going on in Montreal in 1972, and we attended all kinds of concerts and dances and things. Of course, it was affordable for teenage kids to go and see great shows back then. In 1972, the Rolling Stones played in Montreal, and they were using Stevie Wonder as an opening act. The price, $3.50, and $5.50 if you wanted to spring for the expensive seats. I remember those shows at the Montreal Forum where you would walk in and there would be an enormous haze of smoke and you would get high just walking into the building. It was the one place where kids could all smoke and they knew that no cop would bother them because they didn't want to risk a riot. My girlfriend and I went to lots of these, had a lot of fun, hung out with friends. And then I remember this one particular weekend in early December. There was a dance being held at our high school. I still remember the name of the band. The Whackers. Kind of funny. And it was the beginning of sort of that androgynous rock period. The beginning of glam. Bands were transitioning from looking like farmers to actually starting to do a lot more stage pyrotechnics and theater. So having secured our $2 ticket, we went to the dance. Got inside, said hi to a lot of our friends. You were allowed to smoke cigarettes in high school dances then. I know that sounds a bit weird, but there was a lot more freedom then. So soon enough the house lights go down. Then the band comes out on stage in full regalia. This is pretty cool, thought I, as we nipped into a corner and I lit up a previously prepared spliff for us to smoke. No sooner had I sparked it up than this pair of hands grabbed my shoulders, picked me up and said, "I caught one." It was some big asshole from the football team, and he grabbed me and dragged me out of the dance. I quickly ditched the rest of what I had and sent it flying. Somebody found a gift that night. Anyway, my girlfriend followed me outside. She was yelling and screaming at this guy, saying, "You pig, it's pigs like you that screw up the world, you fascist." And I was just so impressed. I thought, I really, really love this woman. She seemed as angry at the world as I was. By this time, she'd attracted quite the scene. The vice principal was there, and also I think the principal and 3 members of the administration were there, and she was screaming at them all, saying, "You pig, you fascist pig." It was really cool. To this day, she still remains one of the most intelligent people I have ever known. By the age I knew her, she had taught herself to read Greek, as well as read all the classics. She was absolutely brilliant, and her marks in school, of course, reflected this. At this point, she was still kind of an unknown quality at our high school, and so the vice principal looked at some other member of the administration and said, "Does she go to school here?" To which he replied, "Yes, she's one of ours." "Well, she certainly won't be come Monday." Well, after that transpired, we were still outside in a snowstorm in a Montreal winter, with no way to get home but walk. So walk we did. Cool, I thought. If she gets suspended or expelled, I'll just skip school and we can hang out together and do all kinds of weird things. Well, by the end of the weekend, things had changed dramatically. The next night, we were all partying back in St. Anne de Bellevue. It was Saturday night, and I was determined to not let the night before ruin our weekend. I remember all of us sitting there with cheap apple cider that we'd bought at the corner store and a gram or 2 of hash between about 5 of us. But man, we were having fun. And I started making out with my girlfriend, and she seemed really hot and bothered, so somehow we ended up in this day-glow-lit bedroom upstairs with Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon playing. She seemed more passionate, more yearning than I'd ever known. We were embracing and kissing passionately, getting real hot and bothered, and I said, "Wait." Not wanting to be a teenage father, I ran downstairs because I knew my friend had a couple of condoms in his wallet, and I begged him for one. My adolescent hormones raging, I raced up the stairs and jumped in bed. All of a sudden, though, something had changed. Whereas 5 minutes earlier she was passionate and ready and willing, now she was distant and cold and didn't seem to want to kiss or anything. My first reaction, being a very horny teenager, was anger and frustration and thinking, why did she play me like that? That's not like her, that's weird. But somehow I went, oh, well, I guess something happened. Maybe she's not well, or, it's something had happened in that couple of minutes that I'd been downstairs. I didn't know. So I said, well, come on, I'll walk you home now. So we walked in silence for a while. And then I said, well, what's going on? Well, and she looked at me strangely and said, what are you talking about? I said, well, back at my friend's house there, you were all ready to go, and then something happened. A strange laugh came out of her. I thought, okay, well, this chick's whacked, so I'm gonna go home and not worry about it. I remember that night it was crisp, cold, and clear. The type of night in the wintertime when all the stars are out and visible. The moon was really, really bright. I remember that. I also remember this set of concrete stairs standing on it with her and looking over at her, and this strange voice came out of her and said, I know everything about you. And it was a male voice, and it seemed devoid of any sort of compassion or humanity whatsoever. Immediately I thought, she's playing me again, and I said, I'm not afraid of you. And immediately she looked at me with ice-cold eyes, and I felt a fear run through me, such as I've never felt before or since. The type of fear that feels like somebody has poured a bucket of ice down your back and you're paralyzed and you can't move kind of fear. I stood there, paralyzed, as if I was waking and having an out-of-body experience. This thing mocked me and knew things about me that they possibly couldn't have known. I remember at this point looking up at the stars and the sky, and instinctively I just kind of said, please God, help me. I didn't even know anything about God. I never wanted to know anything about God. In that moment, though, I felt as small as an ant and as frightened as a field mouse. I have no way of knowing how long I stood there that night, paralyzed with fear. I only know that eventually I snapped out of my funk, and my girlfriend said, come on, Chris, let's go, as if nothing had happened. As I was walking her home, I said, come on, tell me what's going on. This is just too weird. I've had the weirdest night of my life, and you gotta tell me. Are you crazy? Are you a lunatic? Are you having a flashback? What the hell is going on? She just looked at me like a frightened little girl. And she said, if I told you, you would never believe me. I said, give me more credit than that. Tell me. She looked at me plaintively and said, I'm possessed. I didn't know what to think. On the one hand, I'd experienced the most frightening night of my life. And on the other hand, here was this girl who was the girl I loved. At least I thought I did, in a 15-year-old kind of way. I thought I was going crazy, or that I had somehow morphed inside of a horror movie that had gone bad. Not quite sure how I made it home that night. It was 12 miles in the snow, but somehow I managed to find a way. I had fitful dreams that night, frightening dreams, dark dreams. Either I was losing my mind, or this whole thing was real. It was really happening. I spent the next day searching through every occult book I could find for some sort of answer to my questions. I came up empty. There was nothing. There was nothing about this anywhere. That night, I got a phone call from my girlfriend. She said, "The appearance of the room has changed around me. There's candles burning everywhere. I'm really scared, Chris. I'm really scared." Then the phone went dead. I panicked. I didn't know what to do next. I had no way of calling her family downstairs to inform them that something was wrong. I was panicking. I was shaking. I was terrified. I just wanted all this to end. I just wanted it to be over with. I just wanted to be a normal teenager again. Finally, I came up with a thought. I will call the police. Yeah, they'll go over there, and they'll be able to check on her. About half an hour later, I got a call. It was from the San Antonio Bellevue police. When they had arrived at her house, she had been found in a coma. She was immediately rushed to the hospital by ambulance and admitted, a very, very sick girl. Doctors were unsure why she was in a coma. They spent the next couple of days doing all kinds of tests on my unconscious girlfriend, and they weren't sure whether she was going to make it or not. About this time, I was talking with a member of her family, her uncle, in fact, and I had finally confided in him what had happened. Rather than laugh at me, he believed me. He had happened to be kind of a crazy Christian guy, and I didn't even know that about him. He just seemed like a nice person. And he was convinced that what had been happening was real. You see, during her days as a runaway, she had been involved in some pretty serious magical ritual activities. Combined with LSD, something seemed to have stuck to her. He then asked me if I believed in God and Jesus, and I said sure, oh yeah. Although I really wasn't sure, and I'd spent most of my life battling the Catholic Church as I grew up, because it was kind of a repressive atmosphere being educated by nuns as I was. And going to a Catholic high school, I had done my best to outrage all of my religion teachers. I remember once in grade 8, we were asked to write an essay from Jesus' life, translated to modern times being 1972. So I had written this story about Jesus and his disciples playing at a huge rock concert, and there was only a couple of grams of hash and a few joints for the entire crowd, and Jesus manifested all this dope. Well, I think it didn't go over very well with the Irish Catholic teacher. Nobody liked me. I was a smart ass. But back to my story. After 3 days, my girlfriend still wasn't getting any better. In fact, she'd gone downhill. She had machines hooked up to her. It was a scary time for me because I'd never been in a situation like this. This almost seemed like a television show or something coming to reality. There was a sense of unreality about it, even though it was happening. My girlfriend's uncle picked me up after school that day to take me to the hospital to see her. And of course my heart was broken. He had also contacted a Catholic priest who the doctor had agreed to allow us into the room alone. I guess he thought that the priest was going to give last rites. I have a little trouble recounting this next part because the horror of it was so intense. I can describe it. I can describe the voices that came out. I can describe more than I care to remember. Suffice to say, my head was spinning around, and all of a sudden I decided pretty quickly that I was a Christian. I was scared shitless. We were in that hospital room for over 3 hours, and nobody came in. Not a nurse, not a doctor, nobody. Nobody human, that is. There were a litany of names that were called out. Some I had heard, some strange ones that I had never heard. The priest was doing his thing, and it was somehow the most emotionally draining experience of my life. One day I was a teenager, getting excited about going to the dance on Friday night, and 5 days later, here I was in the middle of an exorcism in a hospital, watching my girlfriend, or what I thought was my girlfriend. That incident was to have lasting repercussions in my life. I just didn't understand what was going on. It was like being in the middle of a war zone, in a way. I stood there traumatized again, feeling that paralyzing fear, and yet just praying over and over and over again that this would all end happily somehow. Into the 3rd hour, I can't tell if it was really 3 hours because I was so confused, and It was like having a nightmare, but it was real. It was really happening. Either that or I was part of a mind control cult or something. I wasn't sure. I just remember those eyes looking at me with the most contemptuous hate that you could possibly imagine. I can remember the smirk looking at me and laughing at me. Into the third hour, my girlfriend said, I believe in Jesus now. Jesus help me. So being totally inadequately prepared for this whole experience, I thought that was the end of the battle. But it wasn't. Things got worse. Finally, the most disgusting and vile voice came out of her and said he was Lucifer because all the others had been chased out, so to speak. I still have cold chills trying to tell this story today. Talking about this is bringing me great distress, but at the same time, I'm treating it as therapeutic, and that all things in life happen for a reason. We just don't understand them always. Finally, it stopped. It stopped. Like if you'd been in the middle of a really bad war zone and all of a sudden the shelling stopped. It all stopped. Suddenly. Quickly. I was exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally, in every way you can possibly imagine. She then came out of her coma, slowly, bit by bit, and there was the girl that I recognized, exhausted, but glowing somehow. It was very strange. Everything was strange, and it didn't make any sense. A couple of days later, she was released from the hospital. The doctors had no clue what had happened. To them, it was just a spontaneous cure. To me, it was the beginning of a long and difficult journey. Although I didn't know it at the time. The day she was released from the hospital, we were driving along the highway and this brilliant beam of sun was hitting the car, as if God himself were smiling and touching that vehicle that we were in. My fear had turned to some kind of religious ecstasy. Although, being that age, it really didn't last for long. Not with me. With her it did. And so, as I became more and more enamored of wanting to be like before and go to concerts and have sex and take drugs, she would have none of it. And so our relationship ended. I never found out what happened to her. I know somehow she had moved away. I heard a couple of things. It doesn't really matter. It's just like it doesn't really matter what anybody thinks of this story. I had to put it out here. I had to put out what happened to me because holding it inside is not good. I know that Christians will take it to mean one thing. Maybe psychologists would take it to mean an entirely different thing. Atheists may decide that it's a fantasy and a delusion, perhaps brought on by drugs. After we broke up, I ran fast and far from God. I really wanted to experience all that life had to offer. I was quite enamored with smoking pot and doing all the things that I guess a Christian's not supposed to do. I even tried to block this stuff out of my memory, tried to push it aside, tried to pretend it never happened. But it did happen. And what anybody thinks about it is not my concern. I'm not trying to convert anybody to a religious belief. I'm certainly not trying to make money. There's no ads allowed on this. So why am I doing it? Because I'm old. And I just lost somebody in my family. And none of us know from one day to the next what's going to happen to us. So I felt compelled to tell this story, this true life story. And only each one of you can decide what it means and whether it's true. Because I know it's the truth, and I know what happened to me, and I know that it influences me to this day 42 years later. That's it for the first True Life Chronicles. I'll move on to the next phase of my life the next time I decide to make one of these. Hope it wasn't too boring. Bye, everybody.